Hi, here's another antenna video from SDRplay. Many SDR receiver users have limited access to outside space. So with them in mind, in this video, Mike Harwood compares two popular active loop antennas for use below 30 MHz indoors. As with previous videos, Mike is using an SDRplay RSPduo with its two independent tuners, allowing you to take snapshots of simultaneous reception from two completely different antennas. Over to you, Mike.
Hello and welcome to another high frequency antenna comparison, this time between two magnetic loop antennas in an indoor location. On the left we have the Deshiro GA450, a small 22 cm loop intended for indoor use. In fact, it's only really intended for indoor use. No attempts have been made to make the antenna waterproof, and the comparatively small signal from the tiny loop is made large by tuning, a process that requires the user to be close to the antenna. The benefit of tuning is improved noise performance and intermodulation distortion compared to a conventional wideband loop. The loop's amplifier is battery powered using an internal lithium-ion battery. On the right is the MLA30+, a more conventional magnetic wideband loop. This loop has a diameter of approximately 70 cm, so it can just about be used indoors conveniently, but it is more unwieldy and more difficult to rotate than the GA450. However, the MLA30+ does not require tuning. It derives its power from a standard USB power supply with a bias T arrangement. These are all supplied with the part. The comparison between the two antennas is made with both antennas receiving exactly the same signal at exactly the same time. A dual tuner, the RSPduo by SDRplay, is used for the comparison. The results are displayed using the SDRuno graphical software package. Here is the GA450 antenna and all the accessories that come with it. The loop and amplifier come as two boxes that plug together with a joint that allows the antenna to rotate through 360 degrees. There is a single control knob on the amplifier, a potentiometer with on-off switch. The on-off switch turns the antenna amplifier off and on, and the potentiometer provides tuning of the loop along with a BB112 varactor diode through about 2 octaves. This isn't really enough of a range, and it results in the top and bottom ends of the frequency range for the antenna only being approximately tuned. The GA450 frequency range is from 2.2 MHz to 30 MHz, so an additional coax lead is provided to allow coverage of the medium wave frequency band. A USB to USB-C charging cable is provided, along with a 1 meter BNC cable, which is almost certainly not going to be long enough for any practical situation. Before going to the antenna comparison itself, it's probably worth going through a few notes that are relevant to both antennas. Since the GA450 is battery powered, it is very immune to power supply noise compared to the MLA30+. However, the batteries only last for a few hours, so if your way of working involves fairly long sessions like monitoring FT8 or Whisper overnight, this could be a problem with this type of antenna. With the MLA30+, that isn't an issue because it receives its power through the bias T and an external power supply. The GA450 is a complete antenna. No assembly of sorts is needed, it just plugs together. Some antennas, not the MLA30+, but others require soldering and putting things in boxes, and it just becomes more of a DIY exercise for those who don't like that sort of thing. Rotation of the GA450 to improve signal strength and null out noise is very easy and effective. Whilst the GA450 has a fairly solid 22 cm loop, the MLA30+ is provided with a flimsy wire loop, and some additional construction may be needed to make this more robust and keep it in a circular form. The GA450 requires tuning as mentioned earlier, The MLA30 Plus doesn't. If your way of working is to go to one band, look for something interesting, regularly switch bands, this could become a bit irritating after a while, so it's just worth bearing in mind before you make an antenna purchase decision. And due to the MLA30 Plus's larger diameter, rotating it in an indoor location is much more problematic. The GA450 really is very well designed for placing on a windowsill and rotating to null out noise and receive the strongest signal. In terms of pricing, as of May 2022, the GA450 costs about £90 from Moonraker. The MLA30 Plus is really available online through many different sources on eBay and Amazon, and typically costs between about £40 and £50, depending on where you want to buy it from and delivery schedules. Before we get to the results of the antenna comparison, I just wanted to say a little bit about how the results were fairly obtained. So both antennas were configured in the factory format as supplied. No modifications were made by myself. Both loops had their planes facing north-south, so the maximum received radiation pattern was orientated east-west with a null in the north-south direction. The GA450 was powered from its internal battery, as I mentioned before. The MLA30 Plus LNA was powered through a micro USB connector from a low-noise USB power supply and bias T. In fact, I'll correct that. It's not a micro USB connector, it's a USB-C connector. The USB cable used for the RSPduo was a trip light with the ferrite clamps as supplied with the cable. Measurements for both loops were taken simultaneously during the daytime. All SDRuno display settings for the waterfall plots were identical for the two loops, absolutely identical, to allow an easy visual comparison. So things like gain, contrast, the base of the display, the range, all of those are exactly the same for both antennas. And with the RSPduo, there is an RF gain control separate for each tuner, and this was optimized for each loop individually to allow it to perform at its best. Under most cases, that was normally the maximum setting, but under certain conditions, for example, medium wave, that sometimes isn't the case. I'll now show a summary of the testing between the two antennas. The rest of the video will be devoted to a series of screenshots that were used to enable me to form that opinion. So over a process of several days testing both antennas, I concluded the GA450 really is a true indoor antenna. It's small, a reasonable signal to noise ratio is achieved over most of the high frequency bands if tuning is used. The MLA30 Plus is really an outdoor antenna, and to be fair, it is described as such. It's about 70 centimeters in diameter, so it's smaller than some of the larger wideband loops, so it can be used indoors, but it is a little bit large, a little bit unwieldy, and it is, as I say, it is designed with waterproofing and protection against adverse environmental conditions so that it can be used outside. The GA450 is advertised as working between a range of about 2.3 MHz and 30 MHz. I think it's fair to say good performance was obtained over this range, but the use of tuning to optimise the SNR only really operated between about 4 MHz and 16 MHz, and I believe part of that is due to the way the tuning is performed with the BB112 varactor diode. It just doesn't have the tuning range when you allow for the fact that the frequency depends as the square root of the capacitance to cover a much larger range. Certainly not with the operating voltages available within the GA450. The MLA30 Plus is advertised as having a working range between 500 kHz and 30 MHz, and certainly good performance was obtained over 500 kHz to 20 MHz. I would say the performance was quite reasonable down to 200 kHz, so I think they probably underspecified it a bit there. It wasn't as good as, say, a more conventional loop like a Wellbrook or LZ1AQ or Bonito, but the performance was not bad at 200 kHz. Although I think it is fair to say, though, that above 20 MHz, the performance of certainly the MLA30 Plus that I tested certainly did drop off. In terms of how the two loops compared together, I'd say below 6 MHz, the MLA30 Plus outperformed the GA450. I think it just came down to the size of the loop and the voltage that was induced in it, and the relative noise performance of the two amplifiers. Between 6 to 18 megahertz, when the tuning for the GA450 was operable, then I think that a comparison between the tuned GA450 and an untuned, because it doesn't need to be tuned, MLA30 Plus resulted in very similar levels of performance. Above 20 megahertz, the GA450 really was superior, even though it was outside its performance optimization range. The MLA30 Plus did tend to die off just above 20 megahertz. One concern I did have with the GA450 was stability or instability. It's very apparent that internal oscillations were seen at about 1100 kilohertz or 1.1 megahertz, and from a lot of harmonics of those up to about 30 megahertz. And these appeared over a number of the bands, and to be honest, it could block out signals if they happen to occur at the wrong place. So that could be an issue with a particular unit that I had, although I have seen on the internet other people complaining about similar observations. The reason I formed a conclusion it was an internal oscillation as opposed to intermodulation distortion or something else was the fact that it's quite a large signal. You'll see it, the largest things it receives on some bands are oscillations from itself. And also, if you take the MLA30 Plus loop and move it closer to the GA450, it can itself pick up the oscillation from the GA450. So it's fairly obvious that it is some sort of instability between the loop and the first stage of the amplifier. And in a way that this does detract from some of the other excellent features of this antenna. So as I said, the rest of the antenna will describe those measurements that supported the above statements. As mentioned earlier, the rest of the video will be devoted to showing the qualitative results that were taken with the GA450 and the MLA30 Plus that drew the conclusions that I previously presented. The format of the slides will be in the form of two SDRuno panels, the top one being for the GA450 loop and the bottom one for the MLA30 Plus loop. At the right hand side of each set of panels will be the spectral distribution of the received signal in that band and the waterfall curve, which is really a historical representation of the spectral distribution. So these show the results for long wave, which is on 198 kilohertz, and this is the Radio 4 Droitwich transmission in the UK. For the GA450, a signal-to-noise ratio of about 17.9 dBs was obtained, whereas for the MLA30 Plus, 38.7 dBs was obtained. Now, these results were outside the described or advertised operating range for both antennas. However, under these conditions, it's certainly true to say that the MLA30 Plus was certainly the better performer, giving quite respectable performance, whereas the GA450, really, this would not be respectable for a communications receiver. Here is a summary of the results for the medium wave band. The cursor is placed at 909 kilohertz, that is the Radio 5 live station, and the signal-to-noise ratio for the GA450 is about 24.5 dBs. For the MLA30 Plus, it's 34.6 dBs, so still a good 10 dBs of signal-to-noise advantage in favour of the MLA30 Plus. The GA450, though, is making up a lot of the difference from the deficit seen on the long-wave band. However, of more importance than this, really, is the large peak shown for the GA450, indicated with the red ellipse. That is not a received signal, that is the 1100 kilohertz oscillation that I mentioned earlier, which is blanking out a lot of the signals, or a few of the signals at least, local to that frequency. And perhaps more importantly as well, that 1100 kilohertz signal has a lot of harmonics that will be seen on subsequent screenshots from the spectral distribution later on in the video. Here are the results from the 49 meter broadcast band. Frequency of 6150 kilohertz was chosen as the one I was going to analyse because it was a fairly small signal in terms of amplitude, but it had a very consistent level of performance. The signal to noise ratio for the GA450, once tuned, was 12.6 dBs, and for the MLA30 Plus it was 11.5 dBs. So these could fluctuate a little bit. Sometimes one was better than the other, sometimes it reversed. So I think probably the best description is to say in this band, both antennas had a very, very comparable signal to noise ratio. On the 40-meter amateur band, a very similar level of performance was obtained on an amateur transmission, 9.1 dBs for the GA450 versus 8 dBs for the MLA30 Plus. So again, identical to within 1 dB. Probably the most interesting part of this graph is the fact that you can see that the input signal level is quite a bit higher for the GA450 than the MLA30 Plus. Presumably this is a combination of the gain of the amplifier and the multiplication by the Q of the input tune circuit. Looking at the FT8 performance on the 40-meter band, a signal to noise ratio from both antennas within a fraction of a dB was obtained, showing again a very similar level of performance between both loops. On the 31-meter broadcast band, a very similar level of performance was seen between the two loops, the MLA30 Plus being slightly better, judged by the reported signal to noise ratio on 9420 kHz. Of more importance is actually the oscillation that you can see towards the top right hand side of the display, shown with the red ellipse. This again is the same harmonic of the oscillation that I spoke about before. It's not actually blanking out any signals in this case because there aren't any, but under other conditions it certainly has the capability to do so. Again, on 30 meters, a very similar level of performance was observed between the two loops. On the 25-meter broadcast band, the MLA30 Plus did have the edge, and on this particular signal at 11.79 MHz, the advantage was about 8 dBs on signal to noise in favour of the MLA30 Plus. Again, of more concern perhaps is the fact that there is the oscillation or harmonic of the original oscillation shown in the red ellipse, and in this case it is actually blanking out a couple of signals that could be received quite strongly on the MLA30 Plus. Near identical results are seen on the 22-meter band. Again, on the 20-meter amateur band, the MLA30 Plus had a slight edge in terms of signal to noise ratio. However, of more importance is yet another harmonic of the oscillation, which is showing its ugly head and is also blanking out a couple of signals on the 20-meter band. Here you can see a spectral plot of the FT8 transmission on the 20-meter band and also the degradation on the GA450 from the harmonic of the oscillation just to the right of the FT8 section of the display. On the 90-meter broadcast band, a very similar level of performance is seen at 15.58 MHz in terms of signal to noise ratio, but yet again a harmonic of the original 1100 kHz oscillation is present. On the 17-meter amateur band, a very similar signal to noise ratio is seen with both loops on a fairly strong amateur transmission. And the same is true on a very weak amateur transmission. And on the 10-meter amateur band, the MLA30 Plus really couldn't receive anything whatsoever. The GA450 could, even though it was outside the tuning optimization range, as we discussed earlier. And that brings us to the end of this evaluation, where we've looked at two quite different small magnetic loop antennas. If you have any questions, comments or suggestions, please add them to the comment field below. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mike, for that excellent in-depth comparison. And if you have any comments on Mike's video and the assumptions used, feel free to add your comments, and this can help guide and influence future videos that Mike will be undertaking in the weeks ahead. Thanks for watching.